Like many people, I was made redundant at the start of the recession, and I relocated to Scotland, got myself a temporary job in an outdoor shop, and rapidly became very bored. And decided what I needed was a challenge, some sort of adventure to motivate myself. And I'd always wanted to go to St Kilda in the Outer Hebrides, so I thought what I'd do is I'd sea kayak there from mainland Scotland via Skye in the Outer Hebrides. And in the process of researching that expedition, I came across a story about some Spanish sailors who had been shipwrecked in the 1600s near somewhere called Rockall, and they'd made it safely back to St Kilda. Now, I knew nothing about Rockall. I wasn't a fan of the shipping forecast, but the more I read about the place, the more I became intrigued. And I quickly discovered that there were two occupation records there, one set by a guy called Tom McLean in 1985. He's an ex-SAS soldier who occupied Rockall for 40 days on his own to reaffirm Britain's claim to the rock. Then in 1997, Greenpeace landed by helicopter, and they had a group on the rock for 42 days, and they declared an independent state of waveland to protect the oil and gas reserves out there. So these were the two records that I suddenly decided that I was going to break. Now, Rockall is about 250 miles out into the North Atlantic from the Outer Hebrides. It's about another 190 miles further offshore than St Kilda, which most people think is the edge of the British Isles. It's off the edge of the continental shelf. It's so far out, it's in a different time zone. It's GMT -1. It takes about 15 hours in a motor cruiser to get there, and once you're there, it's just a lump of rock. It's about 17 metres high, about 25 metres wide at its base, and all that lives there really are seabirds and a few lichens. The top's vaguely flat. The Royal Engineers blew that off to put a navigation light on, which broke the following winter. And just below that, there's a small ledge called Hall's Ledge, which is named after Basil Hall, the first guy who was recorded to have landed there in 1811. And that's where Greenpeace and Tom had put their shelters and where I was planning to put mine. So the first thing I needed was a shelter. Now, you can't really go and buy these things, and a tent wasn't going to do the job, so I had to build something. And coming home one day, I saw a water bowser at the side of the road by some roadworks. I thought, that's the thing for me, I'll convert that. So the first thing I did was I got some yacht hatches, so I could get in the top and so I could see out the side and ventilate it. And then I bolted on 12 one-ton fixing points, which I would use to tie the pod down to Rockall using ratchet straps. Greenpeace had left some stainless steel fixings on the rock, and I was going to augment those. And internally, all I did was really flatten out the floor, put a shelf in for some bits and bobs of equipment, and it was lined with spray-on insulation foam to try and keep it a bit cosy. So once that was built, I had to test it, and my plan was that I was going to take it to Rockall on a boat, float it to the rock, tow it over with a tender, and then winch it up the side of the rock. So first things first, did it float? So I took it up to my local canal. There's a dry dock there, and they had a crane, and we dropped it into the water, broke through the ice on that winter's day. Unfortunately, it floated. I then got on it, and it was really stable, and I bravely got inside, and there were no leaks, so that was test one passed. The next thing, a friend and I drove it up to a local quarry behind a climbing wall near me, and there we practiced winching it. And I'd identified a portable petrol capstan winch in Canada, which was designed for pulling moose out of forests once you've shot them. And the plan was that that should be strong enough to lift it up the rock. So really, the first test was to see was the winch strong enough, which it was, but the pod caught on all the rock features. The nose would pile into the side of the rock, creating a lot of friction, made it difficult to lift, and the lifting point would swing around quite a bit. So having done that first round of testing, I had to go away and modify the pod specifically for the winching section of the expedition. And to do that, I basically just flattened off the base with a big bit of plywood, and I set a central lifting point and then two anchor points further down from the nose of the pod, so that when it was lifted up, the nose would pull away from the rock and just the tail would drag up the cliff face. So those were the two rounds of testing done. We did another round of winching, and that went really, really well, so the modifications had worked. So then I had to get to Rockall. Now, you needed a boat to get there, obviously. People historically had used yachts. Now, my problem with that was that they're relatively slow, not particularly maneuverable on site. I didn't understand all the ropes, and there's not really any clear deck space for getting equipment on and off the back of the boat. What I needed was a motor cruiser. Now, the problem is that motor cruiser would have to be Category 0 licensed to take passengers offshore. There are very few of those around. I found a couple of tugs in Southampton, but I've had to have paid them to come to Scotland before I paid them to take me to Rockall, so it was all going to get too expensive. I was talking to some chaps who do day trips to St Kilda, and they told me that they were about to launch a motorised catamaran in the spring of 2012. And the purpose of that was twofold. One, so they could take more people to St Kilda in the summer, but they had quite a long down season in the winter, and they wanted a workboat they could go and do contract jobs on. And this thing had quite a large open rear deck and a crane on the back. It was motorised, very manoeuvrable, ideal boat. So in the May 2012, we went on a reconnaissance. The boat had just been launched. They wanted to check it could get to Rockall. I wanted to see how I performed offshore. I've never been there before. And I also wanted to go and see what the landing and the climbing was like, how big was Hall's Ledge for myself. So this is a picture of me landing at the Queen's Jubilee weekend in 2012. The landing went fairly well. The climbing was good. It was a really coarse, grippy rock. Got up onto the summit, down to Hall's Ledge, and I sent the first tweet and Facebook update from Rockall and got a very nice letter from the Queen thanking me for doing that and wishing her a happy Jubilee. So once that reconnaissance was done, I felt that I was pretty ready to go for the big expedition, but I needed to pay for it. It took me about a year to raise the funding, and then again in May 2013 I was ready to go. Same boat, same crew, all the equipment was there and ready. We had quite a tight weather window. It's 15 hours, as I say, out to Rockall. We decided to go for it. The boat had other charters later in the month, so I had quite a tight window to work with. We got on site, and unfortunately the swell that was forecast had come in too early, much too high and dangerous for me to try and land. The skipper wasn't happy to put his boat and his crew in danger. He eventually called Index, and we turned around and limped the 15 hours back home again. Now obviously at that point I've spent half my fuel budget, so I needed to raise some more money, plus the boat was out on other charters, and I was now cutting into the 2-month clear weather window where I could break the records on the rock. So I put the expedition to bed for the rest of the year. Spring 2014 came, I had the funding, and it was time to go again. Same boat, same crew. Went the 15 hours out there, and the weather conditions were brilliant. Landing went fairly well. It was almost, it had previously been a jump off the tender onto the rock, but this time it was more of a step off. Good, quick scramble up and onto the summit, swiftly followed by one of the crew members. And up on the ledge there, we man-hauled up the winch, the ropes, and some climbing hardware before we winched the pod up the side of the cliff. You can see there the nose of the pod tipping out from the rock, which it was planned. And it literally, from leaving the water to being on Hall's Ledge, was about 5 minutes to get the pod up the rock. We then brought up the rest of my kit and equipment. The crew member climbed back down to the boat, and the boat disappeared off over the horizon. The next couple of days for me were all about getting set up and secure. First of all, I had to tie the pod down. I used some of the existing Greenpeace stainless steel fixings. I also put some more of my own in. Got food and water and supplies into the pod, and I set up a wind turbine up on the summit to power all the technology I had with me. I had laptop, satellite phone, emergency EPIRBs, all that sort of stuff, video camera, so that all needed power. But once all that was set up and I was secure, it was about settling into a routine for me. And I was really about trying to cut into my waking hours as much as possible. So I tried not to get out of my bed until about 9 o'clock every morning. Spent about an hour having breakfast. Quite a nice, lazy, relaxed day, really. Lunch was about 2 o'clock, and I'd eat about 7. And then in between those times, it was really defined by the weather. You know, if it was wet, I'd generally be in the pod because it was dangerous out, slippy on the rock, covered in guano, and I'd be reading e-books or pretending to try and play the harmonica and learn Italian, which I failed completely at. And if it was dry, then I'd be out on the rock exercising, trying to keep my strength up for my eventual departure and any emergencies. And I was also collecting rock and water samples for St Andrews University and invertebrates for the Hunterian Museum. And I set up a GNS survey on the summit to try and ascertain the true height of Rockall, which we now know is 17 metres. Day to day after that was all, as I say, all about killing time. The real kind of highlight or low light for me was in day 28, had quite a big storm came in, took away 4 barrels of equipment and food. That meant that I had to cut the expedition short because I only had about 50 days worth of food left. and had to tie that in with weather and boat charter availability. But the records came. Day 41, I was the new solo record holder, and at day 43, I'd been there longer than anybody in history. And when I got back from the expedition, there was obviously a round of interviews to go through, TV, press, newspapers, that sort of thing, and someone posed the question to me about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Now, fortunately, I was never lonely on Rockall, so I couldn't really answer the question, but the question about what was being alone like sort of fired a seed in my head again, a concept that had been annoying me whilst I was on the rock about this whole solo aspect of the expedition. Had I been eroding that somehow in my planning and preparation with the technology I had with me? As I mentioned, I had a laptop, I had a satellite phone, I had a spot emergency transmitter. I also had a cutting-edge BGAN satellite aerial, which gave me faster broadband than my home broadband connection. Now, I wasn't streaming movies the whole time, and that's really the concept, that was that with modern technology, it is possible to Skype. And I was Skyping to do live TV interviews to the US, for example, from the Rock, because it had never been done before. And I mentioned previously, you'll have picked up from the other slides and what I was saying, that there were quite a lot of people involved in the planning and preparation for this expedition. And I had a VHF radio with me on the Rock. I could have been speaking to passing fishing vessels and other shipping that was around all the time. I specifically chose not to do that because I wanted to enjoy the solo aspect of the expedition and being on my own. But also I didn't want the psychological impact of suddenly losing that communication channel to be a big issue for me on the Rock out there on my own. As I say, I wasn't lonely. I had birds and whales to talk to, and that kept my morale up. Some say I might have been going slightly mad, but just being able to chat away to a bird you recognise is sometimes quite good for morale. The storm itself, day 28, I was lying there in my pod that night on my own, with the wind howling, the waves battering the pod, in fact moving the pod across the ledge. There was no one there to help me that night, lying there in fear for my life. Helicopter rescue was at least 2.5 hours away, if they could get to me in those conditions. There was no one there to help me. But I got there with a team. It was very much a team effort. And this is again where this problem in my head was, where is the line between being alone and being solo drawn, and is there a line to be drawn at all? In my view, my expedition was very much a solo endeavour. The planning and preparation had all been about the team. Explorers Web, who monitor and assess mountaineering and polar expeditions, and first have a definition of solo, and that is that one, you've got to be on your own, but two, there's no resupply whilst you're there. And I certainly fitted into that category. But the telecommunications capabilities I had meant that, in theory, I could have been seeing and speaking to people every day. The only thing I wasn't doing was touching them. And going forward, I think that's going to be a real problem for solo expeditions. We are currently limited only by battery life, the cost of airtime, and equipment weight on mobile expeditions. When all those issues are sorted out, then I can foresee a time when a polar explorer is trudging through Antarctica with a head-up display, talking to and seeing his family and friends. That will have a significant impact on his morale, his mental state, and therefore his performance. Will we then have to redefine solo? Will solo expeditions have to define themselves by the technology they take, and we're going to have separate criteria for solo expeditions and adventures? I don't know. It's a further debate to be had. But certainly, I think my expedition fitted into the current solo criteria. Hopefully you do too. But going forward, there are issues to be resolved. Thank you.